Alright, what's going on guys, it's Epoxy, and I haven't had the time to cover a lot of the info coming out of Cyberpunk 2077 outside of Night City Wire Episode 2, as I was solely focused on my 2 trailer analysis videos, which if you haven't watched, I really suggest you do so. However, I figured today we would go ahead here in this video and go through loads of new Cyberpunk 2077 info we have received over the last week and a half, from new developer interviews, unreleased footage, new screenshots, and much more. This is going to be yet another very long info dump video, which means I'll of course be sure to timestamp it. So if there are any topics you've already heard, feel free to jump past it. Just keep in mind there might be some bonus details you could miss along the way. But with that said, let's roll the intro. Now, before we dive into the loads of new details for today, I want to take a quick look at some community creations for Cyberpunk 2077. The first of which is this insanely detailed and accurate samurai jacket created by Valentine Costumes that took over 5 months and 400 hours to finish. Not only did we get a ton of new images around 2 weeks ago, but we have since gotten a full 15-minute long video taking a close look at the jacket and all of its insane details. So the image album, video, and Valentine Costumes Instagram will all be linked in the description below, so you can check this out for yourself and give them a follow after this video. But I just wanted to highlight this as the amount of talent and dedication it takes to make something like this. It's honestly just insane. We also got some updated photos of the Royce cosplay, which just looks wild. This is all done by the talented Mary Beard and Vulture Productions. This was actually one of the cosplay contest entries for Cyberpunk 2077, which was filled with a ton of talented people. And then we got the Night City map version 0.04.1 by Devianaut with multiple different views. We got the minimal view, the default view plus known locations, and the default view plus mission paths. The amount of dedication that Devianaut has shown by updating this map constantly has been awesome to see, and it looks great. So I'll be sure to keep you all updated if we see any future iterations to it. We also got a bit of a tease for a potential Cyberpunk 2077 Fall Guys collab, so we might just see a Cyberpunk themed outfit in Fall Guys sometime in the near future, which, by the way, that game is a blast. If you have not tried it, I really suggest you do so. I still haven't gotten a dub, but then again, I'm only like level 6 so far, and there are already some people that are complete sweats in that game. But now, on to the real news. Let's begin with 8 new screenshots released for the game following Night City Wire Episode 2, which came our way from Radek Grabowski, lead PR manager at CD Projekt Red. So our first screenshot is of the dialogue with an Arasaka agent. We can see that this dialogue takes place in Lizzie's bar during the Corpo Rat mission, which is the main quest prologue for the Corpo Lifepath. We can actually tell this is the same table which you sit next to Jackie in the B-roll footage of this prologue mission, so these agents likely come up to you during or following that conversation. The screenshot makes me think if there is a feature in the game that hides names of certain characters that are lesser known until you meet them for yourself and learn their name. I say that as we are in dialogue with this guy, but he is only known as Arasaka Agent, which seems kind of generic for someone important enough to be talking to you. I feel like the characters you'll be coming into contact during the main quest will have names, so I think his name is either revealed during this dialogue or sometime later in the game. As for the dialogue, we can see that he says, "V, is that right?" And our potential responses are, "Don't believe we've met," or "You're from headquarters." Speaking of the dialogue options, we can see that this screenshot is using mouse and keyboard with F as the dialogue selection key. A lot of people have been waiting for acknowledgement of mouse and keyboard in the game, so there you go. Of course, we can see 2 other agents in this shot as well. The guy on the right looks like Cyclops from X-Men, and the big boy to the left that people have shared a lot of love for on social media. He looks like he's able to crush anyone in Night City. Now, the second screenshot is of the Nomad prologue, where we actually get a more detailed look at the Aldecados camp out in the Badlands, which we got a sneak peek of in the Lifepath trailer. You can see both the Aldecados sign and logo in this screenshot. In this screenshot, we can also see Nomad V, a Nomad child, which, for those of you that don't know, kids were previously confirmed to be featured in the game as non-combatants, and for whatever reason, there is someone wearing an outfit with an Arasaka logo on it. I don't know if they stole that outfit or if that's trying to allude to something here. Our third screenshot gives us a fresh look at Kirk Sawyer in the Valentino's bar that you start in during the Street Kid Lifepath. He's yet another fixer in Night City, but more specifically in the Watson district, and is actually the one who offers V the job of stealing a Rayfield erendite, just as we saw in Night City Wire Episode 1. In the screenshot, he's seen saying, "Ha, you know me." I'm a man of the biz, so I need to know what I get out of it. With 2 dialogue options for the player, that being I'll owe you one and you avoid trouble. Our 4th screenshot is a combat clip where V is in quite the pickle with the tiger claws in what seems to be the alleyways of Little China. We can see 2 enemies on the screen, but a total of 8 on the minimap. We can also see that there are a total of 4 dead as well, 2 of which we can see in the background. I'm thinking that the color differences of the corpses on the minimap signifies the tier of loot available for pickup from that specific corpse. I say this as we see 3 of the confirmed loot tiers, that being green for common, blue for uncommon, and purple for rare. We can see this loot tier coming into play on the minimap in past clips, such as when Arasaka is seen trying to stop you at the border after smuggling in the extinct iguana. Either way, we can also see a nether icon, which we have seen multiple times in the past. It's unconfirmed as to what it is for, but it seems to be available all throughout Night City. I asked about it on Twitter, and someone actually suggested that it could maybe be some form of stash system, which actually makes a lot of sense. A stash system was actually added to The Witcher 3 in patch 1.07 to enable better management of loot and encumbrance for loot whores such as myself. We know that Cyberpunk 2077 is going to offer a lot of loot to collect, and I'm sure CD Projekt Red is well aware that people aren't going to want to toss out all of their beloved items. So we see these icons scattered all throughout Night City, and they are always visible on the map, just like The Witcher 3 stashes. It's also what looks like a box or a crate with a down arrow, implying that you put items in it. And while it's similar to the loot icon on corpses, it's not the exact same icon, as you can see in this comparison here. Now, if this is the case, this puts to rest the worries of a lot of people, including myself, on keeping our favorite weapons and clothing that we discover throughout the game. Now, the 5th screenshot gives us another look at a part of the Nomad prologue mission inside the garage during the dialogue with the sheriff. Here we see him asking, "Where do your clan pitch camp?" with 2 responses, "I'm here alone," and "What do you have against nomads?" While we don't really see anything new from this screenshot, we do catch another glimpse of a blue Quadra Type 66, and that car looks badass. Now, moving on to the 6th image, this one might just have to be my favorite, as it features our first real look at a newly revealed heavy sniper rifle, which I mentioned in my Tools of Destruction trailer analysis video. And I have to say this again, this is giving me anti-material rifle vibes from Fallout New Vegas. I also question if it is loaded with some form of flammable ammo, as we can see the dead guy on the ground burning, and nothing else flammable seems to be in sight. For those of you that can't guess it, this seems to be another crew of scavengers, as they're rocking similar outfits as to what we've seen in the past. But again, it could just be a group of random thugs. I question if there will be any group names for these smaller groups of scavs or thugs around Night City, as we can actually see clear graffiti in the background that says the Candy Vandals. Whether that has any relation to the group seen here is purely speculation. The last thing I want to point out is those damn hands. CD Projekt Red has done a really good job with the realism of the hands in Cyberpunk 2077, which I truly appreciate, seeing as we'll be seeing them practically the entire game. But seriously, look at those veins. Our 7th screenshot is of Padre, both priest and fixer in the Haywood district. He is known as a very dangerous man, but he and V go a long ways back. That is, if you start off as a street kid. While this doesn't show us much of anything new, it gives us a more detailed look at both Padre and the interior of his vehicle. And our final new screenshot gives us the information we were lacking in the Lifepath trailer analysis video. During the trailer, I pointed out that they didn't show us the description for the 2071 slide shown in the Arasaka lobby. But this screenshot does, and it solidifies what I was suggesting in the analysis video. In quotes, Arasaka security forces prevent mass riots in San Francisco, saving the city from certain ruin. So that gives us a bit more lore for San Francisco, which has seemingly been brought up a number of times in relation to Cyberpunk 2077, which we know is apparently 4 to 6 hours away. So I question if any future content will touch on that location, or if CD Projekt Red is just trying to flesh out more of the details of the surrounding area. But that wraps up all the screenshots that we've received following Night City Wire Episode 2. Now I want to take a look at a few of the snippets of unreleased gameplay that we got from the Chinese gameplay walkthrough that released a few days before Night City Wire Episode 2. This is just some additional footage to go along with the B-roll footage that we got from Night City Wire Episode 1. There isn't a lot of new gameplay here, but we did get a few scenes we didn't get from the previous release of B-roll footage, and it also shows what looks to be some improvements as well for some of the complaints seen in Episode 1. First of which is this updated look at Lizzie's bar, in which we can see is much more populated and lively than the last look we got in episode 1. A lot of people pointed out how dead Night City seemed in the previous footage, so this is a good bit of gameplay to show otherwise. Whether that was something improved upon from the criticism, or if the initial gameplay just so happened to have lower spawn rates at the time, is unknown. All we know is that the bar is looking much better in this gameplay. We also get an updated look at the gameplay driving out of the Badlands, which from the looks of it seems like they've been polishing up some of the harsh pop-in seen in the previous gameplay. It's far from perfect, but they seem to be on the right track with this, and we also get to see a clearer look at the border and Night City off in the distance. Then we get an uncut look at Arasaka trying to stop V and Jackie smuggling the extinct iguana through the border, in which we even get a look at what I believe to be a hint screen. I can't read Chinese, so that's all you get from me on this one. We can also see that this Dara Polytechnic revolver shotgun that we've pointed out in the past seems to actually be called the DR5, which we didn't previously know. Now, something really great is an updated look at a location we've seen before, but back in 2018. So here's a little bit of a comparison of how much the game has improved over the years. Obviously, there are going to be some things that affect the scene, such as lighting, that could make it look better, but I think it's pretty obvious that with that put aside, the game has still seen a massive upgrade over the years, which is to be expected after 2 additional years of development. Of course, the entire walkthrough varied a bit when compared to the English gameplay walkthrough, so I'll leave the full gameplay linked in the description below for you to check out for yourself. Now let's take a look at the first interview that came out of the event, that being an interview from VG247 with senior gameplay designer Pavel Kapala, in which they cover everything from ongoing improvements to the melee combat, legendary weapons, weapon mods, character progression, and more. Let's start at the top, because this is really different to The Witcher. When you were first approaching the game, were there any particular inspirations in terms of gun feel and handling? We definitely looked around, and we shopped around, and we saw nearly every game that comes out in the last couple of years. The biggest problem that we encountered there is that most of the games that we play or played or tested, they are shooters with RPG elements, and we're not aiming to do that. We're basically going from the opposite side. So first of all, we're an RPG, of course, and then we're adding shooter elements on top of that. Most of the games that we encountered have a great feeling of shooting somebody. Things like effects, visual effects, sound effects, animations, all of that was looked at, and we were actually inspired by a couple of major titles there. However, like I said, the problem is that you have to implement those RPG systems into the shooting mechanics, and what that means is that suddenly most of the games that we were looking at basically disintegrate, because you need to scale things that those games do not scale. So stuff like recoil, for example, isn't something that is a static variable anymore, like the movement of your camera, the amount of spread that weapons have, the charge time, the reload time, all of those things need to suddenly be scalable and throughout the entire experience. So we definitely looked at other games when it comes to visual feedback for the player and what feels good as you're pulling the trigger, so to speak, on the gun. However, most of our work was spent on developing and creating the RPG systems so that the player can see that as the game progresses, the player basically becomes better and better in using those weapons. In which he was then asked, how do you balance that? Because you said about recoil, right? And when I was thinking of shooting in an RPG and the RPG leveling making recoil better, the first thing I think of is the first Mass Effect game, where you start out and your reticle is this big, and then as you level up, it gets smaller and smaller to represent your accuracy. But that also led to the frustration where you'd be pointing straight at someone, pulling the trigger, and bullets would be going off and missing. In which Kapala responded, yes, absolutely. That was the biggest problem I feel like we needed to solve. So basically, to merge those two systems like you noticed, if you start on the heavier side of the RPG, I would say. If your spread is too big, like if it envelops 1/4 of your screen, it makes it impossible to hit anything, and that brings that frustration to the player. We really don't want to create that feeling. However, you also need to have that sizable portion of all the variables to be tweakable and to be progressive. So in general, you have two types of variables on the weapon side. You have variables that are controllable by the player or semi-controllable by the player, like for example, the recoil. Recoil can be smaller or larger. So this would be the movement of the camera as you're firing. Something like CSGO has big recoil, right? But proficient players can still control it. However, spread is the size of the crosshair as you're firing the gun, and that's something that's completely random. You cannot foresee where the bullet will go next because it's just a huge chunk of your screen. And what we learned during our development process is that we much prefer scaling recoil, so something that the player can control still even at the beginning of the game, then scaling spread. So spread will still be scalable, but it's not infuriating at the beginning, and it scales a little bit less than recoil, which you can still control as the player. And that alleviated a lot of that frustration, at least for us. And I think that players will experience a similar thing, that basically you can learn the guns. So while all of that was complex, I think you can appreciate the effort they put into making this an RPG first and foremost, but balancing that with features so it doesn't turn into a frustrating experience of the player having zero control over, say, a weapon spray pattern. A good example of that frustration is actually Fallout 3, where you can't ADS and at lower levels, bullets just spray randomly across your screen. That game takes that RPG mechanic to the extreme, which is what they want to avoid, but they still want the RPG elements to influence your weapon proficiency over time. So it's more of a blend between RPG and FPS mechanics for the shooting element, where it takes into account the RPG mechanics for the base, but still opens up the ability for the player skill and knowledge of a weapon to give them an upper hand. I think this sounds like a perfect balance, so we'll see how it actually turns out in the game. He was then asked, a big thing in shooters is the world tends to be more reactive to bullets, whether that is the enemies or shooting out lights, the world itself, whatever. RPGs tend to scale back on that. So how reactive is your world? Is it more reactive than your average shooter RPG? In which he responded, oh, absolutely. We put a lot of emphasis on having destructible environments overall in our game. Players will experience things ranging from very simple, so for example, if you have a shootout in a bar and you're shooting the environment, you will see glasses exploding or things like beer bottles disintegrating on bullet impact. We wanted to have that feeling that basically after you're done with a shootout, the place where you had that shootout is destroyed. But this ranges up to very big portions of the level. We have stuff like destructible cover. So we want the players to actually use some of the weapons to destroy the cover so that the enemies are at a disadvantage. We have destructible glass. All of those things give you the feeling that projectiles from your weapons actually carry power with them. And this also extends to stuff like you will see bullet decals on most of the things. All of the things in the level. You will see different hit reactions. Like for example, if you hit a pipe with water in it, you will see the water sprouting from the place that you hit. And this extends to nearly every object that we have in the game. He was then asked a follow-up question, just quickly, as an aside from that, what about character deaths? Is that canned animations or is that physics? What goes on there? And he responded, it would be a mixture of the two. It depends on the strength of your weapon. So if you headshot somebody with a small caliber pistol, you would not expect him to go into ragdoll necessarily, or just to fly away. Like, we're not doing a Quentin Tarantino movie. However, if you have a grenade explosion, you will see that bodies actually get dismembered, they go into ragdoll, and they get flung away from the center of the explosion. And this extends to weapons as well. So depending on the strength of your weapon, the overall power of your weapon, you will see different results there on NPC death. So that's right, the world will have a certain level of destruction as we've seen in the past. It might not be Battlefield level, but I don't think that would be very fitting for this game anyways. Now my biggest question following this is how they will treat those destroyed environments over time, as I don't see the game saving that destroyed state forever. In some situations, such as the example he gave of causing chaos in a bar, you'd figure that that bar might change state over time. So it'll be interesting to see how they handled that. He then asked about legendary weapons. In the Night City Wire interview, they talked a little bit about the legendary weapons that are attached to specific quests. I got the impression that, for instance, depending on how you tackle a mission, you might get a different legendary at the end, compared to, say, if you go in all guns blazing versus stealth. Can you talk a little bit about how that works? And he went into a lot of detail. We need to remember that it's not like you finish a quest and you get a reward. We don't want to have that artificial type of game loop in our game, necessarily. It's more of a situation where you helped a certain NPC, like, let's say you helped Meredith Stout that we had in our demo. If you help her and then continue your relationship with her, you can get a certain legendary weapon from her because she rewards you as a character. It's not necessarily that the legendary weapon falls out of the sky, so to speak, but that's a part of your choices. Since we're making an RPG, you will not know that when you're making those choices. It's not like we're informing the player, oh, are you certain that you want to help this character? Because that character has a special weapon for you. It's a part of our RPG system that your actions have consequences, and some of those consequences are that basically you will not get rewarded by certain NPCs that you meet in the game. And it's not the core of why you should help those NPCs. So the decision shouldn't be made depending on which weapon you want to have. The decision should be, I want to help that NPC because I like that NPC, or he speaks to my ideas in the game. And then you get rewarded by the NPC in a certain way. And those legendary weapons also are very different, and they will actually give you a certain feeling connected to the NPC that you got it from. So what I'm trying to say is basically they're handcrafted for the specific quest. It's not like you have a completely disconnected weapon that you can see the NPC never using. No, some of the NPCs will actually take out a gun from their own holster, the gun that you saw them use 5 minutes ago. This gun has a specific visual to it that will not be repeated anywhere else in the game, and they will give you this gun, and that feels rewarding because they actually give you something from their own person. So that all is very exciting, but we actually got a bit of a follow-up question on legendaries. If you get one of these, you would assume that an early or mid-game legendary would be outclassed by the late game. Is that the case, or can you upgrade weapons as well as get new ones? Like if you fall in love with a specific weapon, legendary or not, can you upgrade and craft and tinker to bring that along with you as you grow? In which he responded, you can upgrade weapons by using modifications on them, so you can bring them up to a certain level. However, we have so many weapons that we don't want the player to kind of spend their entire game using only one. And what you also have to know is that some legendaries will have, I wouldn't say drawbacks, but will behave in a certain way. And we expect players to pick and choose their favorite guns. And some of those guns will not fit your playstyle. And we're completely okay with that because again, we're making an RPG. So this is a part of the choices that you want to make. Some of the weapons will fit maybe a stealthy character. Some of those weapons will fit a complete solo that goes into every encounter to assault people, never uses stealth. So it's kind of a pick and choose situation there. So all of that information on legendaries particularly excites me a lot about the game, as I'm obsessed with legendary weapons, and to hear that these weapons will actually be unique and you won't really see them coming as a reward either is going to be truly satisfying when you get them. There's nothing worse than a game including legendary weapons that aren't unique whatsoever and only have slightly higher stats than the base variants and become useless after a few levels. So hearing that you can also upgrade weapons along with you to a certain extent is also good to hear. He was then asked, you mentioned stealth there, so that leads us into another thought. How do you make sure that there's that RPG increase in power for all players without just introducing bigger, louder guns? In the respect that if a player's focusing on stealth, they might be focusing on a certain weapon type, like pistols. So how do you make sure that that growth is there for someone who doesn't want to pick up an assault rifle or an SMG or whatever? In which he responded, what we opted to do pretty early in development is have a system that basically rewards the player for using certain weapons. So as you're using pistols, you get better using pistols. It's not necessarily that you level up a couple of times and you get 20 points and you can spend it on unrelated stuff, so to speak. If you want to use pistols, you get better at using pistols by just using them. So for the player, it's basically a situation where if you've fallen in love with an assault rifle and you want to continue using an assault rifle, you'll get better and better at using it. Stealth and combat don't necessarily fully compete with one another. We expect the players to kind of play a hybrid since we don't have a class system in our game. It's not always a good idea to engage fully in stealth or fully in combat, right? This is something that the players need to decide on their own as they engage in an encounter. So for those of you that are unaware, the system in Cyberpunk 2077 sounds a lot like that of Skyrim, which I personally like, but I know some people don't. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on that one. He was then asked, how do implants and augmentations fold into that, and into combat in general? How do they affect gunplay or melee or any of the combat? What sorts of things can you unlock and use to change the way it plays? In which he responded, so we have specific cyberware that can definitely help you in combat. For example, we've shown one of the active cyberwares on last year's demo, which would be the Sandevistan, which basically temporarily slows down time for you, and that doesn't directly influence the gunplay. However, it gives you a huge edge in combat, and that's what we wanted to do for cyberware overall in our game, is that using it should basically change the way a player approaches encounters. The same thing goes for cyberware that you install in your body. Things like, for example, mantis blades that we've also shown. They are quite difficult to get, since you basically need to engage with the black market to get them. However, they are very powerful military-grade implants that you install in your body, and they have different behavior than the rest of the melee weapons. So if the player installs something like mantis blades, they will give you an edge over your opponents. And he was then asked the follow-up question, and how much limitation is there with stuff like that? Can you have the mantis blades and gorilla arms at the same time? Or is that a trade-off sort of choice? In which he responded, so that would be a trade-off, because basically inside Night City, inside the game world, Mantis Blades and Strong Arms are a complete rebuild of a player character's arms. So you get your arm rebuilt from the upper portion completely down. So there isn't much more stuff that you can fit in there. So yes, we expect the player to make that choice basically. So this is a solid confirmation that you can only have one body augmentation for a specific body part at a time, which a lot of people have been asking about. And it also brings up a very interesting question, and that is as to whether or not you can swap them out in the game. I'm going to assume yes, as you can even reset all your perks in this game, so I don't see why you wouldn't be able to swap out and try different cyberware. He was then asked, can you play through the whole game just almost as a traditional FPS? And also, the flip side of that is, can you play through the whole game and try and go for just an all melee thing? Is that possible in encounters? Or are you going to have sometimes enemies that have got the range on you and you need to switch to a gun? In which he responded, so what I would say here is that overall, the city, Night City, is a very dangerous place, especially at the beginning of the game. Since V is quite an unknown, newish mercenary on the streets of Night City, V needs to use all of the tools they have to defeat certain encounters. And you will see pretty early in the game that there are certain players in Night City that are much more powerful than the player character, and you cannot take them head on. Stuff like big corporations. You cannot necessarily expect that you will survive an encounter with elite forces, such as, for example, Max Tac or Trauma Team. So we encourage the players to engage in different types of approaches, depending on the different types of encounters that you will find in the game. As far as melee combat is concerned, I would say the same thing. So we put a lot of emphasis on the fact that enemies in our game exist in the game world. And if you take out a katana and the encounter, for example, has two snipers, they will not oblige you. They will still shoot at you with their sniper rifles. So you need to basically think about your approach. Yes, it's technically possible to run everywhere with a katana. However, if you see a helicopter, would you charge at it with a knife? I don't think so. It might not be a very good strategy. I fully expect them to, yes. So Kapala seems to suggest that the game will push you to probably pull out a gun. However, if you want to go a full melee playthrough, you still technically have the ability to do so. It just might not be the best time. On the topic of melee, where are you at with melee? This sort of first-person combat is really hard to get right, and Lord knows we've seen Bethesda struggle with it. Honestly, it doesn't quite feel there in your preview build. So where are you guys with melee, with swords and fists and stuff like that? In which he responded, we're still a couple of months before release, and I'm actually right now working on melee. We're spending a lot of time trying to perfect that, and we're not 100% happy, mostly with the visual feedback on the hits on the melee. So we're still working on it. We're continuing to work on it, and I'm happy to say that even right now, it's much better than it was, and it's going to get even better. And we acknowledge that this is something that we need to perfect, basically. But as you said, melee in a first-person game is extremely difficult from the get-go. So it wasn't an easy task, since we basically come from a pedigree of creating third-person perspective games. It was also a big part of our development to actually figure out how do you do melee in a first-person perspective. We're working on it. So first off, gotta love that Bethesda Game Studios roast by VG247, super appreciated. Adding a little bit of spicy roasts into an interview question is always a fun time. However, the important thing here to note is this is now a focus point of their development right now, leading up to launch. So for everyone that was criticizing it, they're working on it. Also, don't expect a delay over this. I've seen some people memeing about it, but you don't have to worry about it. It's not like they need to completely remake Melee from scratch. What I think is most important, which I believe we saw a bit of in the recent Katana gameplay, is they need to make the impact of hits feel more real. I think a game that did first-person Melee combat really well was Dying Light, and another is actually Red Dead Redemption 2. Both of those have solid first-person Melee combat that I think Cyberpunk 2077 could take some influence from, as they both feature impactful hits, where it feels like you're actually coming into contact with what you're hitting. That is what makes melee combat feel good, and it looks like they're making solid progress with that based on the latest gameplay, so they're headed in the right direction. He then was asked, this probably applies more to guns than melee, but what are really the benefits of targeting different areas on an enemy's body? Like if you were shooting for the kneecaps or for the feet to try and slow them down, does that sort of thing work? In which he responded, Absolutely. We have different hit reactions per body part of the NPCs. So if somebody's charging at you with a baseball bat, for example, if you shoot them in the kneecap, they will actually fall over. If you want to disarm somebody, quite literally, you can shoot them in the arm, and part of their arm will actually fly off. If you injure somebody in an arm, they might drop their two-handed weapon in favor of using a one-handed pistol. It's not necessarily that we expect the players to use this at every opportunity. However, it's useful to know about this, that sometimes actually engaging the enemies in certain limbs will give you an edge in combat. And this is one of those features that really sells the combat of a game and seems like such a tiny detail at first, but not only does it impact the immersion, but it impacts how you can go about situations, which is great. It adds a lot more depth to the combat. He was then asked, obviously, in an RPG, at a point, you need to have enemies that take a lot of punishment, but how do you avoid bullet spongy enemies, where encounters seem to drag on, and you're shooting someone over and over again? I'm thinking about the big fella you see in the brain dance, who's heavily augmented, in which Kapala corrected and said Atom Smasher. The interviewer then went on to say, right. He's clearly not going to be somebody that goes down in a few hits, no matter what weapon you're using, even if you're using a rocket launcher, I would assume. So how do you balance that to make sure it doesn't cross from challenging to frustrating? In which Kapala responded, so in the core of the game, if we're talking about the normal NPCs that you meet on the street, they can have different rarities to them, I would say. Most of the NPCs that you will meet are normal, just goons. And if you're continuing to level up, and if you're on the level of the enemy, you should never experience bullet sponginess. They will feel quite fast to kill, quite fast to engage. However, they're quite deadly as well. So you need to basically use cover and move around a lot. Some of the NPCs will be more armored or more, how do I say? Some of the NPCs would be like at officer level. So they're more elite enemies that will deal even more damage, and they take a little bit more punishment. However, what we opted to do there is that we basically ensure that hit reactions on our NPCs are always played. This is a big problem in most games that I played that have bullet sponges, that basically you don't see any type of reaction on the NPC as you're hitting them. It feels like you're literally shooting a sponge, like there's nothing there, and we never want to have that. So we will still play hit reactions on those NPCs. You will still see that they're getting hurt. They will stumble. They will fall from your gunfire. So that's still in place. And as far as boss fights are concerned, well, I think it would be best for players to see it for themselves. However, I can assure you that we took the necessary steps not to have them feel like bullet sponges as well. And oh my god, if Cyberpunk 2077 is going to be the first RPG game to truly tackle removing bullet sponges, but in a way that doesn't make the game feel easy mode, that is very exciting. One of the drawbacks of most RPGs is that enemies are bullet sponges and don't react to your shots at all, like Kapala said. So the fact they're opting for a high damage output and high damage received instead of bullet sponges on both sides is very exciting. We also know that this game will be throwing a lot more enemies at you than seen in other RPG games. So that could be one of the ways they go about making it more difficult. Even though the enemies are easier to kill, you're also easier to kill and have more enemies to take on at once. I think a good example of what he's teasing with the boss fights is the different mechanics of the bosses, and also things like shields and weak points. It's not necessarily that they will eat a lot of your bullets, you just have to shoot their weak point, which is harder to get sight of. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out in the game, but I think it will definitely make the combat a solid time. He was then asked, how do weapons tie into the lore of Night City? Because I realize that you've built out that there are specific manufacturers of guns and stuff like that. So do any of those manufacturers have specializations or specific qualities where you go, right, I love this manufacturer's style of guns because they feel a certain way? In which Kapala responded, absolutely. So at the very beginning of development, we actually established which manufacturers do we want to use in our game, and which manufacturers are basically producing higher quality weapons inside the game world, and which are lower quality, I would say. And also, we've put the weapons that we have on a kind of grid that has the quality of the manufacturer on one axis, and on the other axis, it would be time. So you can find weapons that are quite old school. You can find a double-barreled shotgun from Rostovic, which is a Serbian manufacturer in Night City, and they're producing a double-barreled shotgun, but they call it Igla, which is a needle in English. And that would be like an old-school weapon, and basically Rostovic is focusing their production on double-barreled shotguns, and you can find a tech version and a smart version of that, because they're modifying their existing idea. However, you will also find that they're not making the highest quality weapons, because that goes to the biggest weapon manufacturers in our game, which would be Militech and Arasaka. Those huge corporations are basically getting all the weapon production for the army, and all other corporations are actually using their weapons because they're so high level. So you can see that, for example, Arasaka or Militech weapons are the highest quality, and you will feel it in actually using the gun. So stuff like recoil will be controllable, spread will be smaller on those weapons. You will hear that the sound is more subdued. It will feel like an actually well-oiled machine compared to the lower manufacturers. As far as manufacturers creating specific weapon types is concerned, we also have manufacturers such as the Chinese Kangtao, which basically emerged at some point where smart weapons became a possibility inside Night City, inside the game world. And they are completely focused on creating smart weapons. So if you see something that is coming from Kangtao, it's going to be a smart weapon always. This makes me think a lot of how Borderlands handles their weapon manufacturers, where they have a certain style, quality, and perks, I guess you could say. For example, in Borderlands, Tediador weapons are known for being tossed away like a grenade on reload and they explode, doing different damage based on how much ammo is in the weapon at the time. It adds a uniqueness to a manufacturer that you can fall in love with. So it's great to hear this is something we can expect in Night City. And now the final question he was asked during the interview. Finally, you mentioned old school weapons, and I'm thinking, obviously you've got a bit of a time gap in the lore, but I'm thinking about in Cyberpunk 2020, because of when it was written, there's a lot of real world-ish 1990s guns. You see a lot of Uzis in 2020. There are quite a lot of bows and crossbows in Cyberpunk 2022. So are we going to see stuff like that where it's remnants of the past in this game? Are we going to see bows or crossbows at all, for instance? In which he responded, what we wanted to do is basically Cyberpunk 2077 is like a continuation of 2020. So some weapons will fall completely out of use. However, other weapons will still be used in the game world. So I believe that people well versed in Cyberpunk 2020 will actually see a couple of weapons that we took from the textbook, and we tried to put our own spin on them. You can see that actually we're connecting as much as we can to the textbook 2020. We're not trying to shy away from that. However, we also wanted to do our own exploration on the topic of how the world would actually behave during the last 57 years since Cyberpunk 2020 came out. And to be honest, that excites me, but it also makes me feel like that statement there was trying to hint at the fact that things like bows and crossbows have fallen out of use by 2077, as they're just not reasonable weapons by then. So for all the people that were wanting high-tech variants of either of those, I would say temper your expectations. But that is everything for the VG 24/7 interview. But that's not it for the new details from the developers. Let's now take a look at the Discord community Q&A that occurred on the Cyberpunk 2077 Discord with senior level designer Miles Tost and lead quest designer Pavel Sasko. Huge thanks goes to Netrunner 2077 for compiling it all. I just want to note that I'll be cutting out any of the questions that received "I can't tell you" styled answers, as this video will be long enough as it is without that filler. So let's get into it. So it all started off with community members discussing the state of how well all the combat looks compared to previous versions shown, especially the melee combat. And Pavel chimed in to say that they hope we will like it because they've been working extremely hard at getting it just right, including tuning and weight. They were then asked, do these side quests offer the same amount of choices as the main story, or do they differentiate? And they responded, it all depends, you know? We always start from the plot. So if it makes sense for the plot, it means it's there. If it doesn't make sense for the plot, it means there might be less choices depending on what it is. It all depends on what all was introduced to the story, because we want to make sure it makes sense and feels good. Our core principles is always, we want to give the player as many choices as possible, but at the same time stay reasonable, because we need to stay within our given budget. Another thing is we're always trying to give options that feel natural to the player. An example, in quotes, I should be able to do this. In most cases, you will be able to. There will be scenarios where you won't be given choices you'd prefer to make, in order from a design standpoint to not destroy too much of that particular story or sway too much from the vision of choices given for that particular quest. But generally, there are plenty of options for side quests. We've put a lot of attention and detail in them. Obviously, the main quest has a far larger budget than side quests and smaller content, so because of that, you'll probably have slightly less options depending on the quest. It's not really a rule. The rule is a derivative of the plot itself, and I think that makes most sense for us. They were then asked, what is your favorite life path so far? And he responded, oh damn. To be honest, I like all of them because, I mean, if we didn't like it, we wouldn't add it in. So I can't really say. It's really hard for me to pick. They're all really unique in their own way. If there was something we felt was off or didn't like, it would be altered or changed, which I think that reflects pretty well with the polls that have been put out, where when gamers are asked, which life path are you going to choose? They're almost all equal. They were then asked, how confident are you guys in the November release date? And Pavel responded, if I were to answer this question, I would set the Discord on fire. Now just keep in mind that this was Pavel trolling community members, as Lileia then chimed in to say, please don't. We're very confident in the November release date. And while I normally would find reassurance in a statement like that, it's the same thing they said about the release date weeks before it was delayed last time, so we'll just have to wait and see. Pavel was then asked, what is your favorite district to explore? And he responded, I think it has to be Japantown, because it's the most dense and has the most interesting architecture, but it really depends on what you're looking for. They all have their own treats in store to surprise players. And that's very exciting, as we can already tell that all the different districts in Night City, not only are they designed different, but they host different gangs, different characters, and so on. So it's going to be very interesting to explore this world. How long will this game be? I've had this question every interview. It's hard to tell. I really don't know. It really depends on the choices you make and what type of gameplay style you decide to go with. There are far too many complicated factors to give a solid number. And to clarify, I included this in the video for those of you that hammer the devs with this question, but games of this size often vary in length depending on the player. It's not a linear story game, and there are way too many factors to really tell you how long it takes. And that even goes for if you were to just play the main story, because of the amount of different paths there are and how you actually go about situations. So you'll just have to play it to find out. There was a recent news article on your comment about how you don't have to finish the main quest to finish the game. Is it possible for you to expand upon that? Is it how people are assuming? How it's like how you play out your side quests and you get an early ending? Is it a lot simpler than what people are assuming? I would love to clarify on that. I really would, but I'm afraid it'd make headlines anyway. Yeah, nowadays it's difficult without the internet running wild on it. It is correct what From I stated in that interview, but it depends on the definition you're using for what is the side quest and what is the main quest. That's the whole problem. The gist of what I said is, when you decide to do side content, it opens up new paths that allow you to finish the game in more ways that were previously closed for you, and that's really the gist of it. I tried to explain it in the best way I could to the journalist, who mostly understood what I meant, but some wording wasn't completely precise and was Google translated in different ways. Some people understood it correctly, and some people obviously started really stretching it all over the place. At that point, when I try to clarify, it creates even more confusion, so sometimes I don't prefer to comment on it further. So I'd rather not make a mess and cause further confusion. It's difficult at times to explain some things in simple terms due to the complexity of our systems. So I want to say it's very nice to get a clarification on this statement, as this confused a lot of people. I tried to explain it in the best way possible back when I covered this, and I feel like I was closer than what some people were stretching to, but it's nice to know that he simply meant that some side content unlocks different paths for you that were previously locked. That is as simple as it gets for an explanation of this feature. It was mentioned months back that you guys were planning to announce the expansions prior to the game releasing. Is that still on the table? I haven't heard any change of plans from that changing. So as far as I know, that is still happening. Although we're still working on the main game, so it's really a matter of company strategy. If anything changes, we'll make sure we announce it. And this is great to hear, as the expansions for this game will likely be quite large. I've been getting a lot of people questioning where the announcement is for the DLC, as there are so many possibilities for what they could do with it. So I'm happy to know that we'll likely still hear about it before launch. I noticed that vehicles do drive a bit smooth on rough terrains, like out in the Badlands. Are we looking at camera shake effects depending on terrain? It's not a rough question, no doubt, but it's still a work in progress. The thing is, we're still experimenting with a lot of stuff. Also trying out a lot of different things for what would feel best and make most sense. So we're trying to triangulate the best model for players that enjoy our games and find a good balance, but that isn't a racing sim. Who is Takemura? I have no idea. Will the replay value be like The Witcher 2, for example, to where you had to play the game twice in order to get the full experience, or can you see everything in one swing? I think it's going to be way more. I think you need to play the game a few times. You're really going to have to track your choices to fully experience everything the game has to offer. Like in one playthrough, you'll definitely get the core of the game, but to see everything, I think it's impossible unless you decide to play through it a few times. I think you'd have to be pretty disciplined to always pick options that you didn't before, like different builds, different life paths, different choices, let alone character customization. I don't even know how you track that. So probably like 4 or 5 times? It's hard to say. Yeah, possibly. Maybe if you stick to whatever you're picking. Hard to say, honestly. Like, I don't see how it's humanly possible to track every little thing you do in this game and keep up with it. In the world book, it mentions around Watson, relating around City Center, Corpo Plaza, and such, there are roadblocks. Now, are those actual roadblocks that you can cross, or are they actual gameplay roadblocks in a sense that you can't cross into that area until you're done with it? Let's say the prologue. It all depends on the case. Your description was a bit broad. There are scenarios where some parts won't be accessible due to story elements, but it will always be explained to the player why that is. Outside of that, there are always scenarios where players will run across roadblocks where it will telegraph to the player that it will be easier to get around them by foot rather than bike or vehicle. It's just a suggestion to the player, although you'll probably be able to do it any way you please. It's just a telegraph to the player that you have different choices you can make in those particular situations. I don't think you are very often forced off in certain locations. We're very careful when it comes to those things. Of course, in specific story moments, they can occur, but you can easily compare this to what we did in The Witcher 3. And thankfully, this question was brought up and elaborated on for buildings as well, rather than just the roadblocks. Is the blocking of non-accessible buildings or doors contextual? Is there a reason why they're blocked as to why we can't physically enter a particular building or door in the game? Yeah, we try. Not everywhere is like that. We can't put a bouncer in front of every door in the world, but in areas we feel it's super obvious, like if there's an area in the main quest with a door you can't enter, in that context, we'll try to put something extra there. But holy shit, man, the amount of doors we have in Cyberpunk will completely dwarf the amount of doors we have in The Witcher 3. At one point in Witcher 3's development, I counted the amount of doors we have. We have around 2,500 doors for that game. Naturally, in a game like this, compared to Witcher 3, there are far more doors in the world of Cyberpunk. In Night City Wire episode 2, during the guns and modification section, there was a scene where V is fixing his pistol. He's in third-person perspective. Is that just a thing you guys did for the episode, or is that an example of third-person cutscene? It's actually in the game. Yeah, it's called the first equip. Basically like a cool animation you get for a new item you've obtained. It was just cut like that for the trailer, but yes, it's in the actual game. How many options do we have when it comes to obtaining clothes in the game? Do we buy them from shops or can we find them on the ground? Both. You can find them as lootable items and you can also buy them as well. Your typical RPG options are covered. What about jewelry, such as necklaces and rings? We haven't disclosed that information yet, no comment. Which I feel like implies yes, but maybe this could still be on the chopping block, so he didn't want to confirm anything until it's a for sure thing. They then ended up diving into more of the development process and how they always strive to perfect things as creators. And all of this I find very interesting. What is the most amount of times you've gone back to an area to make reiterations? That's You know, I don't want to sound arrogant or anything like that, but that's like asking an artist how happy are they with their painting. You'll find that they never are, that they're never done. I'm fairly confident, much like it was with The Witcher 3, when we ship this, hopefully people will really love it. But once I will be able to play it, I'll end up thinking, oh fuck man, I could have done that better. Why is that there? It's hard to tune out the very minor details that stick out to only the person who designed it. Like, I'll walk through The Witcher 3 and go, fucking hell man, there's a fence floating off the ground like 10 centimeters. Even now, even when we are playing with journalists, sitting next to them playing, like, oh fuck man, I hope he didn't fucking see that. And that just gives you a little bit of an idea that the developers truly do care about all these tiny little details. All the things that you criticize them over, they do care about them, and they do see them themselves. But a game will never be able to be perfect. There are always going to be small little issues, small little design flaws. It happens. In fact, that actually leads us into the next bit. I think that's always going to happen when you present your hard work to a public audience. And he responded, absolutely. Luckily, most of the time you feel like most of the stuff is getting better, but there are times where you don't feel like some iterations are moving certain things forward. But then you come back months later, right? And then take a look back at it, and then it's like, maybe this isn't so bad. And then the solutions become obvious. You keep pushing it, right? And you can't even say that even after 5 iterations, this is the best it can be, right? Because you can even get it right on the second try sometimes. But I will never say you can get it right on the first try. Sometimes it takes 10 attempts to get something right, sometimes more. And then, do you count iterations each time you move a piece of cover ever so slightly? It's a really difficult process. Having said that, each level designer for the game is an owner of one, if not several, quests. That means that they are the level designer assigned to that specific quest, right? Witcher 3 was a bit different. We did more like, here's your locations, you're an owner of that. It could be that you had locations for every multiple quest or just a chunk of that quest. I got lucky. I had some that were more contextually connected in Witcher 3. So you're saying you could easily feel the designer's intent and creativity during quests. What this allowed us to do is be more consistent, for example. I know how this quest starts. I have control over how the levels or locations, transitions, or run off of each other. Like how the bit we showed off in the 2018 demo. The level designers would have been the guy that worked on the scavenger's den at the beginning, then the mega building, etc. You kind of know how the flow goes and you can adjust for the pacing much more easily. You know where to let the players breathe, or you know where more action is needed. You can implement those things as well. I've got a few quests where I keep going back to locations now as well, putting the final polish on them and keep bringing in elements, changing stuff up, playtesting it, realizing, okay, that actually would be nice to have some cover over here when I come from this direction in the game. Then you've got QAs going like, hey, I played your quest or I played your location in this quest and stumbled upon a completely new way to play. Was this supported? Was this intended? And then you alter and adjust as necessary. That way you can say once again that you're never finished, especially with how sandboxy most of our locations are, with the amount of solutions that the player can come up with depending on the playstyles that they have. There will always be something where I'll go, fuck man, I didn't think of the player that used this specific toolkit or combination, and if I had known that, I probably would have provided that thing over here so he could use this thing in a more badass way. That's kind of where we're at now, is looking at all that. What's the one thing you're most proud of that has had a lot of positive public reception? Anything really. It really does go for anything. I don't know, like, this is our baby. Putting our baby in front of people is nerve-wracking. We don't know if it's obvious to the development team, but there are some times where some of the news that comes out is not how the community actually feels, but some people just try to be spiteful and hate for the sake of it. Are the teams aware of this? Well, yeah, we're aware that this is bound to happen. It's always difficult. I guess it really depends on the individual to distance yourself from certain criticism, right? It's easier, like, you know, I guess when you hear voices on the internet, not in your head, then it is more easy to hear the negative ones over the positive ones. Having said that, we have a fucking amazing community, not only on Discord, but on the other platforms like Twitter and Reddit as well. It's really, really cool, and we are blessed with that, and things have been going really nicely so far. Hopefully it stays that way. I will say though that the tension you feel in the studio, not in the physical sense, since we're all at home right now, it was really high, you know? Once we got our first previews in, this was really great for everybody on the team. It was a pretty great moment. I feel like anyone who works creatively has to be able to relate to this, right? You are your own harshest critic, really. As a developer, it's easy to develop a bit of a tunnel vision, and you only see the problems. It's hard to see how far you've actually come. You know, guys, it's been a ride. Coming from 2018 and even before when we transitioned from Blood and Wine into full production of Cyberpunk, and looking at it now, man, it's insane. How do you go about getting into level design and working for a company like CD Projekt Red? There's so many possibilities nowadays for anyone to pick up the tools when it comes to level design and start working. If you download any of the engines like Unity or Unreal, you can basically start blocking out stuff pretty much right away, right? Lots of people start as modders, right? This has become a lot more prominent as of recently. There's more and more universities teaching game design courses. Those can be good, can be. There are more and more ally ways to actually get into level design. I think the most important bit, as with most jobs, is to be interested in the topic and try to educate yourself. There's lots of useful and lots of shitty, I have to say, resources out there. It's simply a matter of engaging with the content and try to learn from it. What I like doing is, I like playing video games. Surprise. Try to look at other developers and see what others have done there and take notes. Do we know who those guys with digital glitch faces are in the gameplay shown earlier today? Oh, you might already know them actually. And this answer is very unhelpful, as this could mean the community guessed it correctly, or we've already seen them in the game. But again, watch my weapons trailer analysis video for my deep dive and speculation on that topic. I think you'll enjoy it. How many power weapons are there? Fucking hell, I don't know. There's a lot. There's a ton of weapons. How I could summarize this is, I think people tend to forget that this is an RPG first and foremost, right? So customization and equipment choices, making choices in the skills you have, the talents, how your character looks, how you choose dialogue is the center stage of this experience. I think some people look at this game and think, oh man, it's a first person and has guns. It's a shooter. And that's a very level assessment. I think in many ways, it's a much deeper role-playing experience than The Witcher 3. And this seems to match with what I've been saying. A lot of people didn't take me seriously in my first Cyberpunk 2077 all-confirmed weapons video when I said that there will likely be many more weapons to be revealed. Since that video, we have seen a huge amount of new weapons. And again, we've only really seen gameplay from the early sections of the game. There are entire weapon manufacturers we haven't seen any weapons from yet. So trust me when I say there are a lot of weapons yet to be seen in this game. In fact, in this Q&A, they mentioned they have an entire team dedicated to making weapons. And while that's it for the community Q&A, we have one more interview to break down, but we're going to do this in more of a point form style as it was translated from Polish. It is a 50-minute Polish interview with interviewer, I'll put his name on screen because you all know how bad I am at pronouncing things, and lead quest designer Pavel Sasko. They have now added English and Russian translations, so I'll leave the full interview linked in the description for anyone that feels like watching and reading a 50-minute interview. However, the initial translations that we'll be using in this video are thanks to Reddit user Super Space Sim, but just keep in mind these are not direct quotes and are in point form. So beginning with the details. The interviewer played the game and was impressed by the amount of details. So Sasko went into some of the details on just how much work went into this, such as they have 4 architectural styles in the game. One concept artist spends time designing even stuff like toilets to match each architectural style. Stuff like pizza boxes or ketchup bottles were designed to match the world. Like the pizza box has a timer on it and shows how fresh the pizza is. If you look into trash bins, you will find out that even trash is designed. Instead of just making generic trash, they took boxes and items they made for the environment and modeled trash using them. I actually covered an example of this in my weapons trailer analysis. When you have meals in restaurants like pad thai, according to lore, meat is provided by all foods. So you can find boxes with all foods logo types next to restaurants. When they were designing the seashore, they were thinking how to lay tracks so it's realistic and makes sense. Sasko was then asked if they worked with futurologists, in which Sasko said they're not trying to predict the future with this game. So it's just based off of the source material and then they ran with it. Such as fat people as an example. You don't have to be fat in Night City. You can modify your body as long as you want to do it and you have the money for it. He also talks a bit about all foods. Basically, farm animals are extinct. All they have are things like rats. So in this world, people make meat using IVF. That's all food. Trauma Team is another example. When you have a platinum card, Trauma Team just go in to extract you and help you. And they don't care if they need to blast some people to do it. Basically, they didn't make those things because they were thinking that will be the future. They just made a world that went the wrong way. A place unbearable to live in. Pavel said he would not want to live in a world like that. The interviewer then asked about world constraint. As for The Witcher, they were constrained by Sapkowski's vision and description of the world. Pavel started by saying that their starting point was Cyberpunk 2020, which was made in 1984. They took what they could from it, but because it's 2077, they had to update the world too. And that gave them some creative freedom. Writers and quest designers worked together to update the world. One of the examples he brought was phones. Young people today won't even see a phone without a touchscreen, so selling them fax machines in 2077 would be problematic. He said that they think a lot about the details because they just love to do it. Like they could just take one architectural style and be done with it. Instead, they made 4, and there are blends of them. Even when they were making guns, they were trying to figure out how to make them in a way that you could build one in real life and it would work, all to increase immersion. The interviewer then couldn't recall from his gameplay session if you chose attributes for your character, in which Pavel reminded him that you could pick attributes that define your strong and weak sides. So sort of like traits or tags in Fallout. And later on, you can improve those stats. The game is an RPG first and they stick to it. You can also improve your character using gear, cyberware, and the skill tree. The interviewer then brought up the game being only first person, basically saying that he didn't have many opportunities to see the character he created. Pavel then responded with a few points. First off, they give you opportunities during gameplay like the inventory and mirrors. You can see yourself in third person while driving a car or motorcycle. There is one more element where you see yourself that they're working on, but they don't want to spoil it. It's likely just photo mode, which is already confirmed, but that's uncertain. They are perfectly aware that people want to see their character, and in the inventory you can zoom in and rotate yourself for a better look. We then got a few questions for Sasko from the fans of the interviewer. First off, are they planning expansions? Cyberpunk will be supported just like The Witcher 3. There will be expansions. Right now, they are focusing on the main content, not expansions. He said that they have so much work that it would be irresponsible to use resources to work on expansions right now. They were then asked, what was the biggest problem during Cyberpunk's production? They had many different problems. For example, they know after Witcher 3, they needed to work on tech. They reworked absolutely everything for Cyberpunk. Basically, they made tech from scratch. Tech in The Witcher 3 would have tied their hands too much. Everything the interviewer saw in the game was designed from scratch. They didn't reuse things from The Witcher 3. That means lore, engine, rendering, streaming, music, sound, everything was done from scratch. And because they were working on technology and a large game, development was really hard because every step had to be coordinated with tech guys. And then they were asked if that was indeed the biggest challenge. They didn't want to just take Witcher 3 and make a Cyberpunk reskin and sell it. They wanted to improve every aspect of the game. One of the examples is that you can hop into a car and drive around a detailed city, and data streaming does not die on you. Streaming also has to handle the vertical aspect of the game, something that was not important in The Witcher 3 because there was not verticality in The Witcher 3. So in The Witcher 3, they only had horizontal data streaming. Basically, they were loading area around you without worrying much about stuff that was above you. And now you have buildings with dozens of floors with full interiors. He was then asked, do you need the best hardware to run it? In which Pavel responded, right now they just simply don't know, because right now they are doing optimizations. It's hard work and there is plenty to do. They said they have many handcrafted moments, like when you enter into cyberspace for the first time and you see the black wall. The cool part is that you have 0 loading screens when you do that, but they had to do some magic to make it work. So basically, before they give you any official info about requirements, they want to optimize the game as much as possible. One of the reasons it is hard is because during optimization, they don't want to sacrifice quality. So the goal is to make it look good and work great. But that wraps up the interview from Newonce. But we also got one very tiny detail from the new interview with Edge Magazine. Speaking in episode 348, lead gameplay designer Michal Dabrowski reveals that CD Projekt Red's intention to capture the feel of a tactical shooter when it comes to Cyberpunk 2077's moment-to-moment gunplay. This extends to the game's weapon proficiency system, which means that the more you use a weapon, the better your character will be at using it in combat. This proficiency, according to him, can reach the point where, in quotes, eventually it'll be like you're using an aimbot. So just how literal he is on that is unknown, but I thought it was a cool snippet to share nonetheless. Next thing I want to touch on is a feature a lot of people thought was going to be in the game, but a couple of weeks ago was confirmed to not be a thing. I forgot to cover this in my last few videos, so I wanted to briefly cover it here in case anyone happened to miss it, that being dual wielding. Someone asked on Twitter if this would be a thing back at the end of July, in which Marcin Mamot, global community lead at CD Projekt Red, gave us all a confirmation that dual wielding will not be a thing in Cyberpunk 2077. And for those of you that are wondering why people assume this would be a feature, it's actually because there is a scene of Jackie dual wielding. I don't think this is going to be a deal breaker for anyone, but I feel this was likely a feature they were wanting to add to the game, but possibly cut as it wasn't looking the best. Dual wielding in games can often look very awkward when it comes to things like reload animations, which may have just not been worth the effort for them to implement. Dual wielding would not just mean that they have to implement the animations for it, but they would have to do the coding, the menu options for actually selecting multiple weapons at once, and trying to balance all of the weapons that get a dual wielding option. I'm not trying to excuse them not adding it, I'm just explaining why I think they likely cut it. That being said, it was never confirmed as a feature in the first place, and we never saw the dual wielding in the game, so we don't know if they were ever planning on adding it as something the player could do. We only saw Jackie doing it. And I'm going to be honest, I would have loved this as a feature, but it's definitely not a deal breaker for me, as the reality is I would have probably used it once and never again. Now I want to take a look at some of the cool details in Cyberpunk 2077 that other people online have spotted. First of which is someone comparing the layout of Cyberpunk 2077's HUD with The Witcher 3, which shows that this game has basically the exact same layout. And to be honest, like a few others have noted, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think this layout actually works perfectly for the game, especially when you consider the fact that this game has dynamic and immersive HUD, whatever you want to call it, meaning that different elements disappear in situations they aren't needed. And this game also has a more slimmed down HUD than seen in The Witcher 3, so overall, cleaning up the HUD and allowing you to immerse more in the world. I personally think it looks good. Next was someone spotting that the Malorian arms pistol, both featured in the old Black Hand Street Weapons 2020 sourcebook, and most recently shown in the Cyberpunk 2077 lore book, was shown in the game during the Night City Wire Episode 2 Johnny Silverhand scene. So yes, this is a weapon that was specifically designed for Johnny Silverhand, and it will be featured in the game. Speaking of the Johnny Silverhand scene, we actually got a look at Kerry Eurodyne, the vocals and lead rhythm guitar for Samurai, who as we can see here has been faithfully recreated in Cyberpunk 2077. Something else someone spotted was that the Grand Imperial Mall that was shown in the Tools of Destruction trailer has what seems to be random goons or scavengers, as I touched on in my analysis video. Something that didn't click in my head was the fact that the animals are known to populate this area, which could imply that areas can be populated with different enemies depending on story progress. What I'm going to suggest though is that we'll just see crossover in areas. You'll sometimes see gangs and enemies outside of their known territories. We've seen this in the past with Tiger Claws being in the 6th Street gang territory. There is a general rule of who is primarily in a location, but that doesn't necessarily mean you won't ever see another gang or random squad of thugs in that territory. That's just my 2 cents. We also got a possible hint at a max level, that being level 50. A few people pointed out this snippet where we can see V is level 50 and just received 0 XP for a kill, implying that the player has hit max level. This could also be the case of once you hit a certain level, killing certain enemies, such as lower levels, won't gain XP. I only suggest that as the XP bar is just over halfway, so it seems like V has still been getting some XP after level 50. So I think it could be more of a soft cap rather than a hard cap. Now, one of the most fascinating connections and details I've spotted over the last few days has been about the subdermal grip, which was brought up as it was missing in the brain dance footage. Now, that may just mean that V hasn't gotten the cyberware yet, but let's take a look at what someone has noticed. In the 2018 gameplay demo, you actually see the subdermal grip gradually disappear off of V's hand, which makes sense as it is called subdermal grip, which uses synthetic skin. So to show this, at 227, after initially installing the subdermal grip, you can see it clearly displayed on V's hand. However, later on in the same footage, at 3457, where V takes a hit, you can no longer see the grip. So it seems like your visible cyberware may become hidden with time. The last thing I want to highlight, spotted by the community, is the small detail of gore in the game. For the most part, we have only really seen people completely explode, heads explode, entire limbs torn off, and that sort of thing. There's even live dismemberment in this game, where you can blow off someone's legs and they'll still be alive. However, we have gotten a look at how there will be less aggressive gore than that as well, where instead of a guy's entire head blowing off, only half of his head gets blown off. It's tiny details like this that will sell the impact of weapons, as entire parts frequently exploding can be quite much. So this is a nice detail to see. Oh wait, and how could I forget? Someone also spotted a notice sign in the game that says, "No children or infants allowed in trash bins," just in case you forgot how fucked up Night City is. And I think that is a perfect place to end off this video. This was by far my longest info dump video of all time, and I think it'll keep that crown. I don't know if my voice will ever be able to do this again, so if you could please share the video if you enjoyed, that would mean the world to me. But that's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please smack that like button down below, subscribe to Unreleased Fight if you haven't already, and ring that bell icon to stay updated in all of my future videos. It would be super greatly appreciated as always, and until next time, this is Epoxy signing off.